The questions presented by this impeachment inquiry are whether President Trump sought to exploit that ally's vulnerability and invite Ukraine's interference in our elections, whether President Trump sought to condition official acts, such as a White House meeting or U.S. military assistance, on Ukraine's willingness to assist with 2 political investigations that would help his re-election campaign. Beginning in January of this year, the President's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, pressed Ukrainian authorities to investigate Burisma, the country's largest national gas producer, and the Bidens, since Vice President Joe Biden was seen as a strong potential challenger to Trump. Giuliani also promoted a debunked conspiracy that it was Ukraine, not Russia, that hacked the 2016 U.S. election. The nation's intelligence agencies have stated unequivocally that it was Russia, not Ukraine, that interfered in our election. But Giuliani believed this conspiracy theory, referred to as CrowdStrike, shorthand for the company that discovered the Russian hack, would aid his client's re-election. Giuliani also conducted a smear campaign against the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. On April 29, a senior State Department official told her that although she had done nothing wrong, President Trump had lost confidence in her. On July 10th, Ambassador Sondland informed a group of U.S. and Ukrainian officials meeting at the White House that according to Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, a White House meeting desperately sought by the Ukrainian president with Trump would happen only if Ukraine undertook an investigation into the energy sector, which was understood to mean Burisma and specifically the Bidens. National Security Advisor Bolton abruptly ended the meeting and said afterwards that he would not be, quote, part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up on this, end quote. If we find that the President of the United States abused his power and invited foreign interference in our elections, or if he sought to condition, coerce, extort, or bribe an ally into conducting investigations to aid his re-election campaign and did so by withholding official acts, a White House meeting, or hundreds of millions of dollars of needed military aid, must we simply get over it?
Anyone familiar with the Democrats' scorched earth war against President Trump would not be surprised to see all the typical signs that this is a carefully orchestrated media smear campaign. For example, after vowing publicly that impeachment requires bipartisan support, Democrats are pushing impeachment forward without the backing of a single Republican. The witnesses deemed suitable for television by the Democrats were put through a closed-door audition process in a cult-like atmosphere in the basement of the Capitol, where Democrats conducted secret depositions, released a flood of misleading and one-sided leaks, and later selectively released transcripts in a highly staged manner. Violating their own guidelines, Democrats repeatedly redacted from the transcripts the name of Alexander Chalupa, a contractor for the Democratic National Committee who worked with Ukrainian officials to collect dirt on the Trump campaign, which she provided to the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign. The Democrats rejected most of the Republicans' witness requests, resulting in a horrifically one-sided process where the crucial witnesses are denied a platform if their testimony does not support the Democrats' absurd accusations. Notably, they are trying to impeach the president for inquiring about Hunter Biden's activities. Yet they refuse our request to hear from Biden himself. The whistleblower was acknowledged to have a bias against President Trump, and his attorney touted a coup against the president and called for his impeachment just weeks after the election. At a prior hearing, Democrats on this committee read out a purely fictitious rendition of the president's phone call with President Zelensky. They clearly found the real conversation to be insufficient for their impeachment narrative, so they just made up a new one. And most egregiously, the staff of the Democrats on this committee had direct discussions with the whistleblower before his or her complaint was submitted to the Inspector General. Republicans can't get a full account of these contacts because Democrats broke their promise to have the whistleblower testify to this committee. Democrat members hid these contacts from Republicans, and then lied about them to the American people on national television. I've noted before, the Democrats have a long habit of accusing Republicans of offenses they themselves are committing. Let's recall, for years they accused the Trump campaign of colluding with Russia when they themselves were colluding with Russia by funding and spreading the Steele dossier, which relied on Russian sources. And now they accuse President Trump of malfeasance in Ukraine when they themselves are culpable. The Democrats cooperated in Ukrainian election meddling, and they defend Hunter Biden's securing of a lavishly paid position with a corrupt Ukrainian company, all while his father served as vice president. Despite this hypocrisy, the Democrats are advancing their impeachment sham. But we should not hold any hearings at all until we get answers to three crucial questions the Democrats are determined to avoid asking. First, what is the full extent of the Democrats' prior coordination with the whistleblower? And who else did the whistleblower coordinate this effort with? Second, what is the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign? And third, why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden, and what did he do for them? And did his position affect any U.S. government actions under the Obama administration? These questions will remain outstanding because Republicans were denied the right to call witnesses that know these answers. What we will witness today is a televised theatrical performance staged by the Democrats. Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Kent, I'd like to welcome you here. I'd like to congratulate you for passing the Democrat Star Chamber auditions held for the last weeks in the basement of the Capitol. It seems you agreed, witting or unwittingly, to participate in a drama. But the main performance, the Russia hoax, has ended, and you've been cast in the low-rent Ukrainian sequel. I'll conclude by noting the immense damage the politicized bureaucracy has done to Americans' faith in government. Though executive branch employees are charged with implementing the policies set by our president, who is elected and responsible to the American people, elements of the civil service have decided that they, not the president, are really in charge. Thus, as we'll learn in these hearings, after expressing skepticism of foreign aid and concern about foreign corruption on the campaign trail, President Trump outraged the bureaucracy by acting skeptically about foreign aid and expressing concerns about foreign corruption. Officials' alarm at the president's actions was typically based on second-hand, third-hand, and even fourth-hand rumors and innuendo. They believed it was an outrage for the president to fire an ambassador, even though the president has full authority to retain or remove diplomats for any reason at any time. Officials showed the surprising lack of interest in the indications of Ukrainian election meddling that deeply concerned the president at whose pleasure they serve. Despite all their dissatisfaction with President Trump's Ukraine policy, the president approved the supply of weapons to Ukraine, unlike the previous administration, which provided blankets as defense against invading Russians. By undermining the president, who they are supposed to be serving, the elements of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and now the State Department have lost the confidence of millions of Americans who believe that their vote should count for something. It will take years, if not decades, to restore faith in these institutions. This spectacle is doing great damage to our country. It's nothing more than an impeachment process in search of a crime. The call summary for which the Democrats want to impeach President Trump is dramatically different from their nefarious depiction of it. What it actually shows is a pleasant exchange between two leaders who discuss mutual cooperation over a range of issues. The Democrats claim this call demonstrates extortion, bribery, and a host of other monstrous crimes being committed against President Zelensky. Yet President Zelensky himself insists there was nothing improper whatsoever about the conversation. Indeed, the routine nature of the call helps to explain why, in this committee's last public hearing, Democrats recited a fictitious version of the call instead of reading the actual transcript. The Democrats depicted the president saying, quote, "I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent, understand? Lots of it, on this and on that," unquote. The transcript did not show President Trump saying anything remotely like that. The president did not ask Ukraine to make up dirt on anyone. But the Democrats are not trying to discover facts, they're trying to invent a narrative. And if the facts they need do not exist, then they'll just make it up. Not only does President Zelensky deny the Democrats' characterization of the call, but as Ambassador Taylor testified to this committee, the Ukrainians did not even know at the time of the call that a temporary delay was put on the security assistance for them. Furthermore, as the ambassador testified, these holds occur from time to time. Both he and Ambassador Volker were confident the delay would be lifted. And in fact, military aid to Ukraine has actually substantially improved since President Trump took office. Ambassador Taylor testified that President Trump was the first president to see that Ukraine was afforded Javelin anti-tank weapons. This was a very strong message that Americans are willing to provide more than blankets. This was the Obama administration's approach. Note this important fact. The security assistance was provided to Ukraine without the Ukrainians having done any of the things they were supposedly being blackmailed to do. So we're supposed to believe that President Trump committed a terrible crime that never actually occurred and which the supposed victim denies ever happened. I'd like to briefly speak about the core mistruth at the heart of the Democrats' impeachment drive. They claim the president tried to get the Ukrainians to, quote, manufacture dirt against his political rivals. This is supported by precisely zero evidence. Once again, the Democrats simply made it up. But let's consider the broader question about why President Trump may have wanted answers to questions about Ukraine meddling in 2016. The Democrats downplay, ignore, or outright deny the many indications that Ukrainians actually did meddle in the election. A shocking about-face for people who for 3 years argued that foreign election meddling was an intolerable crime that threatened the heart of our democracy. While the brazen suddenness of this U-turn is jarring, this denial is a necessary part of their argument. After all, if there actually were indications of Ukraine election meddling, and if foreign election meddling is a dire threat, then President Trump would have a perfectly good reason for wanting to find out what happened. And since the meddling was aimed against his campaign, he'd have good reason for sending his personal attorney to make inquiries about it. What's strange is that some of the witnesses at these hearings and previous depositions who express alarm about these inquiries were remarkably uninformed about these indications of Ukrainian election meddling and why the president may have been concerned by them. For example, I noted previously, Alexander Chalupa, a former staffer for the Democratic National Committee, admitted to Politico that she worked with officials at the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. to dig up dirt on the Trump campaign, which she passed on to the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign. Chalupa revealed that Ukrainian embassy officials themselves were also working directly with reporters to trade information and leads about the Trump campaign. Ambassador Kent, you didn't seem to be too concerned about it in the last round of questioning, so I'll just skip you because we know that wasn't a concern. But Ambassador Taylor, you testified to this committee that you only recently became aware of reports of this cooperation between Ukrainian embassy officials and Chalupa to undermine the Trump campaign. From your last deposition, is that correct?
Mr. Nunes, it is correct that I had not known about this before.
I'm just going over your last deposition.
That's exactly right.
Ambassador.
Yep.
The Politico article cites 3 named Ukrainian officials asserting that the Ukrainian embassy supported the Hillary Clinton campaign. It quotes Ukrainian parliamentarian Andrei Artemenko saying, quote, "It was clear they were supporting Hillary Clinton's candidacy. They did everything from organizing meetings with the Clinton team to publicly supporting her to criticizing Trump. I think that they simply didn't meet with the Trump campaign because they thought Hillary would win," unquote. Ambassador Taylor, you testified you were unfamiliar with that statement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You also said you were unaware that then Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Valerie Chalet, wrote an op-ed in The Hill during the 2016 presidential campaign criticizing then candidate Trump. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You said you did not know that Sergei Lyshenko, then a Ukrainian parliamentarian, had admitted that part of his motivation in spreading information about the so-called Black Ledger, a disputed document purporting to reveal corruption by a former Trump campaign official, was to undermine the Trump's candidacy. This was in your deposition. Is that still correct?
That is still correct, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Fusion GPS contractor Nellie Orr testified to Congress that Lyshenko was a source for Fusion GPS's operation to dirty up the Trump campaign, including the compilation of the Steele dossier on behalf of the DNC and the Clinton campaign. You testified you were unaware that Lyshenko served as a source for that project. Ambassador Taylor, is this still correct?
It is, sir.
You said you did not know that Ukrainian Internal Affairs Minister Arsen Avakov mocked and disparaged then-candidate Trump on Facebook and Twitter. Is that still correct?
That is correct.
Ambassador Taylor, in your testimony to this committee, you said you were never briefed on these reports and statements, that you did not do due diligence before taking your post to discover that the President's and Mayor Giuliani's concerns may have been, and that you did what they may have been, and that you did not discuss them with Ambassador Yovanovitch. That's still correct?
Yes, sir.
Furthermore, you said it upset you to hear about the many indications of Ukrainian election meddling. Your precise words were, I'm going to read them back to you, "Based on this Politico article, which again surprises me, disappoints me, because I think it's a mistake for any diplomat or government official in one country to interfere in the political life of another. That's disappointing," unquote. Ambassador Taylor, is that still your testimony?
Mr. Nunes, it is. Subsequent to that, I looked into the circumstances for several of the things that you just mentioned. In 2016, candidate Trump had made a statement saying that it was possible that he would allow Crimea to go back to Russia. He expressed the sentiment or the opinion that it was possible that Crimea wanted to go back to Russia. What I can tell you, Mr. Nunes, is that that sentiment is amazingly inflammatory to all Ukrainians. So I can understand that. Are you aware during I believe it was the 2012 election when at the time President Obama leaned over on a hot mic to the then Russian president and said that he'd have to wait till after the election? Was that inflammatory to the Ukrainians also? I don't know, sir.
I just want to be clear that some government officials opposed President Trump's approach to Ukraine, but many had no idea what concerned him. In this case, it was numerous indications of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election to oppose his campaign and support Hillary Clinton.
Once you know that, it's easy to understand the president's desire to get to the bottom of this corruption and to discover exactly what happened in the 2016 election. And with that, I'll turn to Mr. Castor.
Ambassador Taylor, Mr. Kent, President Trump's concerns about Ukraine's role in the 2016 election, you believe he genuinely believed they were working against him, right? Ambassador Taylor?
Mr. Castor, I don't know what President or candidate Trump was thinking about the Ukrainians.
I mean, didn't he in this Oval Office meeting on May 23rd after the Zelensky inauguration, didn't he lament that the Ukrainians were out to get him?
I heard that his response to the suggestion that Mr. Zelensky visit President Trump, in the Oval Office was not well received, and that he had concerns about Ukrainians, yes.
But from the president's perspective, if the ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, one of the most influential diplomats, is penning an op-ed, certainly with the okay of President Poroshenko, the DNC consultants are conferring with Ukrainian officials at the embassy. Former Prime Minister Yatsenyuk is saying things on social media. Interior Minister Avakov, who has spanned both the Poroshenko and the Zelensky realm, is also saying some very unkind things on social media about the president. You certainly can appreciate that President Trump was very concerned that some elements of the Ukrainian establishment were not in favor of him, did not support him, and were out to get him.
If I could, and I'll allow the question, but are you asking?
Parliamentary inquiry, are you seriously interrupting our time here?
I will allow the question. I won't dock this from the time. I just want to be clear, Ambassador. If you're able to verify the things that Council has asked you in the prerequisite of the question, that's fine. Otherwise, in questions from the majority or the minority that may assume facts not in evidence before you, you should be cautioned about that.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
The time is with with Minority Counsel.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Chairman, I sat here through the first 45 minutes and literally had an objection to almost the foundation of every question that Mr. Goldman asked regarding facts not in evidence, leading. But House Resolution 660 does not say that we are under the federal rules of evidence. If it is your position that I should be asserting objections to questions that violate the federal rules of evidence, let me know now, because this hearing is going to change significantly.
As I said, Mr. Ratcliffe, I will allow the question.
I think the gentleman has a different question about the rules. So what are the rules that are going to govern this?
Does the ranking member seek recognition?
I'm yielding you to a question I just asked you.
For what purpose do you seek recognition?
To answer Mr. Ratcliffe's question.
I have answered it. May I resume your question?
Respectfully, Mr. Chairman, you haven't answered my question whether or not I should be assumes facts not in evidence or leading objections to questions that are posed from this point forward. That's my question.
Mr. Ratcliffe, I'll say once again, I'm not objecting to the question, but I am instructing the witness that they should not presume questions from the majority or the minority that may represent facts not in evidence are correct. I have answered the question. We will resume the questioning and resume the clock.
Mr. Castor.
So you certainly can appreciate President Trump's concerns.
Aide's held up on July 18th, is that right?
That's when I first heard about it, Mr.
And then it's released, Ambassador Taylor, on September 11th. And we know that from your deposition, in those 55 days that Aide is delayed, you met with President Zelensky 3 times. The first one was July 26th, the day after the famous call now between President Trump and President Zelensky. President Zelensky meets with you, Ambassador Volker, and Ambassador Sondland. And again, according to your deposition and your testimony, there was no linkage of security assistance dollars to investigating Burisma or the Bidens. Second meeting is August 27th. Again, in this 55-day time frame, second meeting is August 27th. President Zelensky meets with you and Ambassador Bolton and others. And again, there's no linkage of dollars, security assistance dollars, to an investigation of the Bidens. And then, of course, the third meeting is September 5th. President Zelensky meets with you and Senators Johnson and Murphy. And once again, there was no linkage of security assistance dollars to an investigation of Burisma or the Bidens. 3 meetings with the president of Ukraine, the new president, and no linkage. That's accurate?
Ms. Jordan, it's certainly accurate on the first two meetings because, to my knowledge, the Ukrainians were not aware of the hold on assistance until the 29th of August.
So the Politico article.
The Politico article. The third meeting that you mentioned with the Senators Murphy and Senator Johnson, there was discussion of the security assistance, but
no linkage.
But there was not discussion of linkage.
3 meetings face-to-face with President Zelensky, no linkage. Yet, in your deposition, you said this, and you said it again in the first hour of the majority. My clear understanding was security assistance money would not come until President Zelensky committed to pursue the investigation. My clear understanding was they weren't going to get the money until President Zelensky committed to pursue the investigations. Now, with all due respect, Ambassador, your clear understanding was obviously wrong because it didn't happen. President Zelensky didn't announce he was going to investigate Burisma or the Bidens. He didn't do a press conference and say, I'm going to investigate the Bidens, we're going to investigate Burisma. He didn't tweet about it, and you just told the ranking member he didn't do the CNN interview and announce he's going to investigate Burisma or the Bidens. So 3 face-to-face meetings, it doesn't come up, no linkage whatsoever. President Zelensky doesn't announce it before the aid is released on the 11th. And yet you said you have a clear understanding that those 2 things were going to happen. The money was going to get released, but not until there was an investigation, and that, in fact, didn't happen. So what I'm wondering is, where did you get this clear understanding?
As I testified, Mr. Jordan, this came from Ambassador Sondland.
Well, can you hold 1 second, Ambassador? I'm going to bring you a piece of paper from Ambassador Sondland's statement.
Very good.
And you can take a look at this. Go ahead, though. I want to let you finish.
So, Mr. Jordan, should I read this or?
No, I just want you to have it because I'm going to read it.
Oh, very good, very good.
But I wanted you to go ahead and finish. You said, Ambassador, you got this from Ambassador Sondland.
That is correct. Ambassador Sondland also said that he talked to President Zelensky and Mr. Yermak and had told them that although this was not a quid pro quo, if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. That was one point. It was also the case.
Mr. Morrison talked to you, right?
No. What I was going to say is Ambassador Sondland also told me that he recognized that it was a mistake to have told the Ukrainians that only the meeting with the president in the Oval Office was held up on in order to get these investigations. No, it was not just the meeting. It was also the security system. That is, everything was. So those two discussions.
No, I understand.
Okay.
All right. So again, just to recap, you had 3 meetings with President Zelensky. No linkage in those 3 meetings came up. Ambassador Zelensky didn't announce that he was going to do any investigation of the Bidens or Burismas before the aid was released. He didn't do a tweet, didn't do anything on CNN, didn't do any of that. President Zelensky, excuse me.
Right.
And then what you have in front of you is an addendum that Mr. Sondland made to his testimony that we got a couple weeks ago. It says, Declaration of Ambassador Gordon Sondland. I, Gordon Sondland, do hereby swear and affirm as follows. I want you to look at point number 2, bullet point number 2, second sentence. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yermak on September 1st, 2019 in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. Now, this is his clarification. Let me read it one more time. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yermak on September 1st, 2019 in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. We got 6 people having 4 conversations in 1 sentence, and you just told me this is where you got your clear understanding. Which, I mean, Even though you had 3 opportunities with President Zelensky for him to tell you, you know what? We're going to do these investigations to get the aid. Didn't tell you 3 different times. Never makes an announcement, never tweets about it, never does a CNN interview. Ambassador, you weren't on the call, were you? You didn't listen on President Trump's call and President Zelensky's call?
I did not.
You've never talked with Chief of Staff Mulvaney?
I never did.
You never met the president?
That's correct.
You had 3 meetings again with Zelensky and it didn't come up.
And 2 of those they had never heard about, as far as I know.
And President
There was no reason for it to come
President
up.
Zelensky never made an announcement. This is what I can't believe. And you're their star witness. You're their first witness.
Mr.
You're the
Jordan,
guy. You're the guy based on this. Based on, I mean, I've seen church prayer chains that are easier to understand than this. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told, now again, this is, I hereby swear and affirm from Gordon Sondland. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 20. This all happens, by the way. This all happens, by the way, in Warsaw, where Vice President Pence meets with President Zelensky. And guess what?
Taylor,
they didn't talk about any linkage either.
Time of the gentleman's expired. Ambassador Taylor, would you like to respond?
The only response, I have 2 responses, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Mr. Jordan. Glad to take those questions. Let me just say that I don't consider myself a star witness for anything.
They do. You don't.
No, I don't. I'm responding to your questions.
Please don't interrupt the witness.
As I think I was clear about, I'm not here to take one side or the other or to advocate any particular outcome. So let me just restate that. Second thing is that my understanding is only coming from people that I talk to.
We got that.
We got that. I think this clarification from Ambassador Sondland was because he said he didn't remember this in his first deposition. So he wanted to kind of clarify. But I think, Mr. Jordan, the way I read this, he remembers it the same way I do.
Yeah, and it's real clear, right?
It's very clear to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Taylor.
It's obvious from your testimony today that you both care a great deal about U.S.-Ukraine relations. It's also very clear that you're optimistic about President Zelensky. Ambassador Taylor, you related one of his first acts in office was to remove immunity from deputies, which had long been a source of corruption. I know you had a number of personal dealings with him. Has he given you any reason to question his honesty or his integrity?
No, sir.
In your prior deposition, I asked you, and I'll read it directly, if nobody in the Ukrainian government is aware of a military hold at the time of the Trump-Zelensky call, then as a matter of law and as a matter of fact, there can be no quid pro quo based on military aid. And to your knowledge, nobody in the Ukrainian government was aware of the hold. And your answer was, that is correct. Is that still your testimony?
Mr. Ratcliffe, at some point in September.
I'm talking about on July 25th.
July 25th. Sorry. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. They did not know this.
All right. And as it turns out, President Zelensky agreed with you. On October 10th, President Zelensky held a press marathon with over 300 reporters where he said repeatedly and consistently over hours and hours that he was not aware of a military hold during the July 25th call. In fact, in his official press release from the Ukrainian government available on his website that I'll be introducing into the record, he said, "Our phone conversation bears no relations to arms. They blocked the provision of military assistance prior to our telephone conversation, but the issue had not been discussed during our conversation. I mean, I didn't even know." So now, in addition to confirming that because he had no knowledge of it, there was no quid pro quo involving military aid during that call, President Zelensky went on to confirm a number of things, that there was no pressure, that there were no conditions, that there were no threats on military aid. There were no conditions or pressure to investigate Burisma or the 2016 election, that there was no blackmail, that there was no corruption of any kind during the July 25th call. Again, from his official press release. Therefore, there was no blackmail because it was not the subject of our conversation with the President of the United States. There were no conditions on the investigation, either because of arms or the situation around Burisma Company. He told Reuters there was no blackmail. He told the LA Times there was no pressure or blackmail from the United States. He told Japan's Kyodo News, "I was never pressured and there were no conditions being imposed." He told ABC News and the BBC I'm against corruption. This is not corruption. It was just a call. The Ukrainian president stood in front of the world press and repeatedly, consistently, over and over again, interview after interview, said he had no knowledge of military aid being withheld, meaning no quid pro quo, no pressure, no demands, no threats, no blackmail, nothing corrupt. And unlike the first 45 minutes that we heard from the Democrats today, that's not secondhand information, it's not hearsay, it's not what someone overheard Ambassador Sondland say. That was his direct testimony. Ambassador Taylor, do you have any evidence to assert that President Zelensky was lying to the world press when he said those things? Yes or no?
Mr. Ratcliffe, if I can respond.
My time is short.
Your time
yes
is
or
short.
no?
That's right. I have no reason to doubt what the president said in his.
Okay, very good. So in this impeachment hearing today, where we impeach presidents for treason or bribery or other high crimes, where is the impeachable offense in that call? Are either of you here today to assert there was an impeachable offense in that call? Shout it out. Anyone?
Mr. Ratcliffe, if I can just respond, let me just reiterate that I'm not here.
I've got 1 minute left.
I know you only got a minute left. I've just got 30 seconds.
Please allow the witness. You asked the witness a question. The witness
I'll withdraw the question. Let me just make this
And I'm not here to
point.
take one side or the other. That's your
Ambassador,
decision.
let me answer this. Let me ask you this
The gentleman will
question.
suspend.
Spend the time,
Ambassador
please.
Taylor, would
Suspend
you like to
time,
answer the
please.
question?
Suspend the time, please. I withdrew the
The
question.
gentleman will suspend. We will suspend the clock.
Suspend the clock
Suspend
at
the clock.
1 minute, please.
Ambassador Taylor, would you like to respond to the question?
Mr. Ratcliffe, I would just like to say that I'm not here to do anything having to do with, to decide about impeachment. That is not what either of us are here to do. This is your job.
Will you restore,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
restore time to the clock to 1 minute?
No, but you may continue 22 seconds.
Fine. Mr. Ambassador, I think everyone knows that House Democrats have made up their mind to impeach one president. The question that we've just learned is whether or not they're prepared to impeach two. Because to be clear, if House Democrats impeach President Trump for a quid pro quo involving military aid, they have to call President Zelensky a liar. If they impeach him for abusing his power or pressuring or making threats or demands, they have to call President Zelensky a liar to do it. If they impeach President Trump for blackmail or extortion or making threats or demand, they have to call President Trump a liar to do it. I yield back.
Mr. Kent, Ambassador Taylor, thank you for your service. I have a great deal of appreciation for your profession. You have very little direct contact with decision makers, a tremendous amount of responsibility, and not a lot of authority to affect U.S. policy, bilateral engagements, or multilateral engagements you're trying to shepherd through issues with our allies. One example of that, Ambassador Taylor, is that you testified in your prior testimony that you have not had any contact with the President of the United States. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Ms. Taylor, Mr. Kent, have you had any contact with the President of the United States?
I have not.
So not only no conversations with the President of the United States about Ukraine, you've not had any contact with the President of the United States, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So you both know that this impeachment inquiry is about the President of the United States, don't you? I mean, the man that neither one of you have had any contact with, you're the first up witnesses. I just find that a little amazing that the first up would be two people who've never had any contact with the president himself. Now, Kurt Volker did have contact with the president and contact with the president on Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador Taylor, you said that he's a man of highest integrity. Well, I know Kurt Volker, and I know he served as the NATO ambassador. He served as the director of the McCain Institute. He's the highest professional ethics, one of the most knowledgeable people about Europe. He's absolutely a truthful man. Mr. Kent, would you agree with Ambassador Taylor that he's of the highest integrity?
I believe Kurt Volker has served the U.S. as a public servant very well.
Do either of you have any evidence that Mr. Volker committed perjury or lied to this committee in his testimony to this committee? Do either of you have any evidence that Kurt Volker perjured himself or lied to this committee in his testimony? Ambassador Taylor, any evidence?
Mr. Turner, I have no evidence.
Ms. Kent.
I believe Ambassador Volker's deposition was over 400 pages, and I don't have it in front of me, so I can't make a judgment.
But you have no evidence that he lied or perjured himself,
I have no
correct, Mr.
basis
Kent?
to make that judgment, no,
Great.
sir.
Well, we're not in a court, gentlemen, and if we were, the Sixth Amendment would apply, and so would rules on hearsay and opinion, and most of your two testimonies would not be admissible whatsoever. But I understand in your profession you deal in words of understanding, words of beliefs and feelings, because in your profession, that's what you work with to try to pull together policy and to go in and out of meetings to try to formulate opinions that affect other people's decision-making. Ambassador Taylor, have you ever prepared for a meeting with the president or a prime minister of a country, or where you were told one thing before you went into the meeting as to what it was to be about, and the meeting be about another thing, or you get in there and the beliefs or opinions of the president or the prime minister were other than you believed?
Mr. Turner, you're asking if I ever learned something new in a
Have you ever walked in with a belief that you thought about the country that you were serving in and find out that they were wrong?
I learned something in every meeting, Mr. Turner, but
Well, Ambassador Taylor, the reason why the Sixth Amendment doesn't allow hearsay is because it's unreliable. It's unreliable because frequently it's untruthful. It is not factual. It might be beliefs or understandings. Ambassador, you testified about a number of things that you heard. Isn't it possible that the things that you heard were not true, that some of the beliefs and understandings that you had are not accurate, that in fact you're mistaken about some of the things that you testified today in a factual basis versus a professional assessment?
Mr. Turner, I'm here to tell you what I know. I'm not going to tell you anything I don't know. I'm going to tell you everything that I do know.
But since you learned it from others,
that's exactly why I'm here.
But since you learned it from others, you could be wrong, correct?
I am telling you what I heard them tell me.
And they could be wrong, or they could be mistaken, or they could have heard it incorrectly. Right, Ambassador Taylor?
People make mistakes.
Right, so you could be wrong. I yield the rest of my time to
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ambassador Taylor, the gentleman asked if you could be wrong. Were you wrong when you said you had a clear understanding that President Zelensky had to commit to an investigation of Biden's before the aide got released, and the aide got released and he didn't commit to an investigation?
Mr. I was not wrong about what I told you, which is what I heard. That's all I've said. I've told you what I heard.
And that's the point. What you heard did not happen. It didn't happen. You had 3 meetings with the guy. He could have told you. He didn't announce he was going to do an investigation before the aide happened. It's not just could it have been wrong. The fact is it was wrong because it didn't happen. The whole point was you had a clear understanding that aide will not get released unless there's a commitment. Not maybe, not I think the aide might happen, and it's my hunch it's going to get released. You use clear language, clear understanding, and commitment, and those 2 things didn't happen, so you had to be wrong.
Ms. Jordan, the other thing that went on when that assistance was on hold is we shook the confidence of a close partner in our reliability. And that's
not what this proceeding is about, Ambassador Taylor.
Has expired. Ambassador
That's
Taylor,
not what this whole thing started on.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Ambassador Taylor, did you want to finish your answer?
No, that's good, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Taylor, this should be easy because I'm going to use a lot of your words from the previous deposition as we go forward. In your deposition, you spoke of support for Ukraine and its relationship to the United States and how much you support that. In 2014, you, and I'm quoting this, urged Obama administration to provide lethal defensive weapons in order to deter further Russian aggression. Did the Obama administration provide lethal weapons?
No, sir.
They provided MREs and blankets and things like that. In your deposition, you also said President Obama's objection was because it might provoke the Russians. And in fact, you testified in your deposition that the Obama administration didn't have a good argument since Russia had already provoked and they have invaded Ukraine. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
It's a shame he didn't take the advice of a combat veteran like you, sir. Someone who understands what deterrence provides. Because a lot of Ukrainian lives could have been saved if he had taken your advice. In your deposition, you said, and I quote, you were happy with Trump administration's assistance. And it provided both lethal and financial aid, did it not?
It did, sir.
And you also stated that it was a substantial improvement. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
So now we're providing javelins, which kill Russian tanks. MREs and blankets do not do that. Today you said I was beginning to fear that the long-standing U.S. policy of strong support for Ukraine was shifting. I have a little trouble with long-standing based on what we just talked about, because it wasn't really long-standing strong support. It seems to me the strong support came with this administration. Would you agree with that, sir? Unless you consider MREs and blankets strong support, I wouldn't call it long-standing.
The long-standing that I'm referring to there, Dr. Winstrup, is the long-standing political support, economic support, and increasing military support.
Well, certainly that strong support came from Congress, but it didn't come from the previous administration as compared to what this administration has decided to do. The strong support came with this administration, not the Obama administration. And maybe now we understand what President Obama meant when he told Russian President Medvedev that he'd have more flexibility after his election. Maybe that flexibility was to deny lethal aid to the Ukraine, allowing Russia to march right in and kill Ukrainians. Again, in your deposition, you urged the Obama administration officials to provide lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine in order to deter further Russian aggression. And now they have that under this administration, don't they, Mr. Ambassador?
They have the javelins, yes, sir.
Thank you. And I would like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Ratcliffe.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. So, no pressure, no demands, no conditions, nothing corrupt, nothing on the call. That's what we heard President Zelensky say. And because House Democrats' charges against President Trump have been publicly, repeatedly, consistently been denied by President Zelensky, you heard the defense now from Chairman Schiff. He's lying because he has to. He has to lie because the threats, the demands, the blackmail, the extortion that House Democrats are alleging, if he didn't do that, he couldn't possibly risk military aid. He would have to do anything he had to secure it. The problem with that, the hole in that argument is you have to ask yourself, what did President Zelensky actually do to get the aid? The answer is nothing. He did nothing. He didn't open any investigations. He didn't call Attorney General Bill Barr. He didn't do any of the things that House Democrats say that he was being forced and coerced and threatened to do. He didn't do anything because he didn't have to. I yield back.
Welcome, I think, to year 4 of the ongoing impeachment of President Trump. I'm sorry that you have been dragged into this. I think the sign behind me says it very well. By the whistleblower's attorney, the coup has started and impeachment will follow. But after listening for what is going on now 4 hours and 21 minutes, after all of the secret hearings, after all of the leaks, after hearing witnesses such as yourselves give your opinions, it really comes down to this. One thing it comes down to. This is the transcript that the President has released of this phone call. There is one sentence, one phone call. That is what this entire impeachment proceeding is based upon. And I got to tell you, if your impeachment case is so weak that you have to lie and exaggerate about it to convince the American people that they need to remove this president, then you've got a problem. And the American people have been lied to again and again on this. We first heard a lot about quid pro quo. And then many people realized that was meaningless, so they said, well, let's go for the fences then. Let's talk about extortion. Let's talk about bribery. Let's talk about cover-up and obstruction, for which there is zero evidence of any of that. We heard a characterization of the president's phone call that was so outrageously inaccurate, it had to be described as a parody. And none of those things matter. None of it matters. It comes down to this. We appreciate your insight. We appreciate your opinion, but all you can do is give your opinion of this one phone call. Let me ask you, gentlemen, both of you have said here today, you have testified, corruption in the Ukraine is endemic. Would we agree on that? Simple question. Problem is, isn't it?
It's a problem, and they're taking steps to address it.
Okay, earlier in the hearing, both of you said, use the word endemic or agreed to it. It's in the courts, it's oligarchs, it's prosecutors, it's everywhere. And I think we can also agree that that's not the only place in the world where we experience and see corruption. There's dozens and dozens of nations around the world that are steeped in corruption. Would you agree with that?
I would say that there's corruption in every country, including ours.
Okay, thank you. And some we're clearly more concerned about than others. So in these corrupt nations, of which there are probably hundreds of corrupt individuals, hundreds of corrupt government officials, can you give me an example any time where the Vice President of the United States shows up and demands that a specific prosecutor be fired and gives them a 6-hour time limit to do that? Are you aware of that ever happening any other place? I guess the answer is no. And I just think it's interesting that out of hundreds of corrupt individuals, dozens of corrupt nations, that happened one time. And it happened with the individual whose son was being paid by the organization that was under investigation. One other thing very quickly. If someone was a candidate for a political office, even for President of the United States, should they be immune from investigation?
No one is above the law, sir.
Thank you. I agree with that. I think we all would agree with that. And yet I think some presume that because some of the individuals we're talking about here were candidates, that they are immune from any questions or any investigation. I think it's absurd. For heaven's sakes, if those of us in public office, those of us who find ourselves up for re-election or all the time as a candidate, I think we have a higher standard, not immunity from asking these types of questions. The last thing, then I'm going to yield my time. Availability of funds, I'm quoting from the NDAA in 2019. The language is specific. Availability of funds under assistance to the Ukraine, it has to be certified. And what has to be certified? Quote, for the purposes of decreasing corruption. Are you surprised that there would be questions about corruption in Ukraine and that it would be discussed withholding some of this aid that's actually required by law that it be withheld if they can't certify that corruption has been eliminated or is being addressed?
The certification in that case is done by the Secretary of Defense upon advice of his staff in consultation with the interagency community. We were fully supportive of that conditionality, and the Secretary of Defense had already certified that that conditionality had been met. And
so we agree that we should withhold funds if there's questions about corruption that have not been addressed. I'm going to yield my rest of my time to Mr. Jordan. Sorry. 18 seconds. You're going to let that go? Thank you. In that case, I will yield back.
Hearsay can be much better evidence than direct, as we have learned in painful instances, and it's certainly valid in this instance.
Well, the gentleman yield because none of those exceptions would apply to this testimony.
It's not the time for colloquy. Representative Stefanik, you're recognized.
Thank you. For the millions of Americans viewing today, the two most important facts are the following. Number one, Ukraine received the aid. Number two, there was in fact no investigation into Biden. Mr. Kent and Ambassador Taylor, you both spoke eloquently and passionately about the need to support Ukraine to counter Russian aggression, particularly during this very critical time. I agree with you in that assessment. And isn't it the case that the Trump administration has indeed provided substantial aid to Ukraine in the form of defensive lethal aid, correct?
That is correct.
And that is more so than the Obama administration, correct?
The Trump
defensive lethal aid?
Yes.
And in the transcript of the president's July 25th call with President Zelensky tells Trump they are ready to buy more javelins. This is indeed the most effective weapon for fighting insurgent armor Russian tanks. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And those javelins were not made available to Ukraine under the Obama administration? The javelins were not made available?
They were not.
Correct. Shifting gears to corruption. One of the themes here today is that of rooting out corruption, which is an important tool for the president as we provide taxpayer-funded aid to foreign countries. Mr. Kent, you would characterize Ukraine as having long-standing corruption issues, correct?
I did.
And in fact, you testified, quote, I would say that corruption is part of the reason why Ukrainians came out to the streets in both 2004 when somebody tried to steal the election and again in 2014 because of a corrupt, kleptocratic, pro-Russian government which eventually collapsed. The Ukrainians decided enough was enough. Is that your testimony?
It remains so.
And you testified that you first came to learn about Burisma in 2015 when you were the senior anti-corruption coordinator, correct?
Correct. Detailed to the embassy in Kyiv as the acting deputy chief of mission.
And you testified that the issue of corruption in Burisma was in the U.S. interest because, quote, and this is from your deposition, we had made a commitment to the Ukrainian government in 2014 to try to recover an estimated tens of billions of dollars of stolen assets out of the country. Is that correct?
That is stolen assets that were in the name of the owner of Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky. He was the one who we believed had stolen the money.
Sure. So the first case, this was the first case that the U.S., the UK, and Ukraine investigators worked on was against the owner of Burisma.
That's correct.
And this was during the Obama administration.
That's correct.
So for the millions of Americans viewing, the first investigation against the owner of Burisma was under President Obama's administration.
That's correct.
You testified also, quote, we spent roughly $500,000 of State Department money in support of the FBI and this investigation to build capacity and track down stolen assets, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was launched in May 2014 by the Attorney General of the U.S. and UK in conjunction with the World Bank.
And in fact, by 2016, you were so concerned about corruption questions related to Burisma that when there was an effort by Burisma to sponsor an essay contest with USAID, you asked USAID to stop it.
That's correct.
And you testified that it was because, quote, Burisma had a poor reputation in the business and that you didn't think it was appropriate for the U.S. government to be co-sponsoring something with a company that had a bad reputation. Correct? You are also aware, and you testified today, that Hunter Biden served on the board of Burisma.
Correct.
And you also testified that you were indeed concerned about the appearance of conflict of interest.
That's correct.
And broadly, this is very important, you testified in your deposition that when the State Department evaluates foreign assistance, it is appropriate for them to look at levels of corruption in countries.
That's correct.
And lastly, you also testified that, and this is your quote, issues of corruption have been part of high-level dialogue between U.S. leaders and Ukrainian leaders, regardless of who is the U.S. leader and who is the Ukrainian leader, and that is a normal issue of diplomatic discussion at the highest level, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I will yield 30 seconds. You know what, I will yield back after that. Thank you.
Mr. Swalwell.
Both of you have testified that you are not direct witnesses who've spoken with President Trump. However, you are witnesses to a shakedown scheme that others participated in who spoke with President Trump.
Mr. Taylor, my first questions are to you, and these are questions that are on years prior to your time in the Ukraine, but I'm pretty sure you can answer them. Did the Ukrainians get aid in FY17?
Did they get any aid in FY17?
Yeah.
Any? Yes, sir. They did get assistance.
And they got security assistance as well.
They did.
And if I said that number was circa, in military assistance, around $270 million, would that probably be accurate? Mr.
Close.
King, about right.
Yeah.
Did they get aid in FY18?
Yes, sir.
Including security assistance.
Including security assistance.
We've already talked about the javelins, the anti-tank missiles that they were not able to purchase in previous administrations. Have they gotten security assistance in FY19?
Yes, sir.
Prior to the $400 million or so that we're discussing or been discussing a lot here today?
They got some previous year, some probably FY18 assistance, but George, you may know.
It takes a while once money is obligated to actually reach the country. There were 2 island-class ships that just arrived in the port of Odessa,
sure.
And that was with prior year money. So there's about a lag of a year.
My point is that we have been supporting the Ukrainians under this administration in order to help them kick out the Russians who invaded their country.
Yes, sir.
100%.
Ambassador Taylor, you earlier testifying that Ukrainian officials did not become aware of potential U.S. assistance being withheld until August 29th. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding, Mr. Hurd.
Would you find it surprising if a Ukrainian official knew about that sooner and did not contact you?
I can answer that it was only after August 29th, when the political article came out, that I got calls from several of the Ukrainian officials.
Good copy. Mr. Kent, Had you had any Ukrainian official contacting you concerned about, when was the first time a Ukrainian official contacted you concerned about potential withholding of U.S. aid?
It was after the article in Political came out in that first intense week of September.
Gotcha. So after that August 29th conversation. There's a lot of talk about Rudy Giuliani and who he was and wasn't meeting. Do we know or have an idea of the Ukrainian officials that he was meeting with over the last couple of years?
I don't, sir.
Have you had any Ukrainian officials call you after a meeting with Rudy Giuliani concerned about the nature or the context of that conversation?
Yes. Mr. Yermak has expressed concern about his interactions with Mr. Giuliani.
And I believe that meeting was somewhere in late August, is that correct?
It was, there were meetings and there were, I think, also phone calls.
And y'all have talked many times that y'all are still concerned about corruption in Ukraine, is that correct?
Sir.
Have we seen whatever this anti-corruption statement we wanted the Ukrainians to make?
Are you referring to the statement that was being negotiated between Kurt Volker, Gordon Sondland, and Andrei Yermak?
Yes.
That was not an anti-corruption statement, sir.
What was the statement?
I think if you go back to the back and forth of WhatsApps that were shared by Kurt Volker, they shared a draft with Rudy Giuliani, and Rudy Giuliani said it would not be acceptable if it didn't mention Biden-Burisma in 2016.
But that statement was never agreed to or was never issued by the Ukrainian officials? Is that correct?
No statement of that sort was issued, correct.
And have U.S. businesses ever contacted y'all concerned about corruption within Ukraine?
Yes, sir.
As of this year even?
Yes, sir.
Because the concern is not just how Ukrainian businesses run by oligarchs are being operated. It's also concerns about how the Ukrainian government is dealing with American businesses trying to operate in Ukraine. Is that accurate?
American businesses are very concerned about the judicial system in particular. Yes, sir.
I yield back in time. I do not have, Mr. Chairman.
Listening to all the evidence, everything I've heard and read in this investigation, it seems to me that the President of the United States either committed extortion and bribery of a foreign official or attempted extortion and bribery of a foreign official.
Thank the Chair. Mr. Kent, in your prior deposition on page 159, you were asked about the President's authority to release an ambassador for any reason, and your response was, quote, "All ambassadors serve at the pleasure of the President, and that is without question. Everybody understands that," end quote. Do you remember saying that?
I do, and it's true.
The President very clearly has that constitutional authority, correct?
He does.
Okay, well, most everybody apparently understands that, but doesn't include House Democrats. In the context of this impeachment inquiry, specifically addressing Ambassador Yovanovitch, who I know is a friend of yours, in alleging an abuse of power in a nationally televised interview, a member of this committee said, quote, "It's an abuse of power to remove an ambassador for political reasons because you don't like what they're doing, period," end quote. That's not true, is it?
Again, I go back to what I said. The President has the right to have ambassadors serve at his pleasure.
Okay, so you agree with me that we shouldn't impeach a president for exercising his constitutional authority?
I'm here as a fact witness to answer your questions. Your constitutional obligation is to consider the evidence before you.
So when did Ambassador Yovanovitch get recalled from Ukraine?
I believe a message was sent on or about April 24th.
Okay. Certainly well before the July 25th call that's in question here, correct?
Without a doubt.
Okay, and she had no remaining responsibilities with respect to Ukraine policy for that 3 or 4 months in between, I take it?
She is now she was transferred to a teaching slot at Georgetown where her responsibilities, among others, were to teach a class on Ukraine.
Okay, so if President Trump had the constitutional authority to remove her, as he did months before the call, and she wasn't in the Ukraine or have any responsibilities on July 25th, do you have an explanation for why Democrats are calling her as a witness on Friday?
I'm here as a fact witness under subpoena, and that's a question you could perhaps direct towards your Democratic colleagues.
Ambassador Taylor, we've established that on July 25th, both participants in the call, both presidents, expressly have stated there was no pressure, no demand, no conditions, no blackmail, no corruption. And I asked you again specifically about a quid pro quo even being possible. And I think we've agreed that it wasn't possible, a quid pro quo involving military aid on July 25th, given President Zelensky's lack of knowledge, correct?
President Zelensky, to my knowledge, did not have any idea that the security systems was on hold.
Okay. So do you have an explanation for why within days of that phone call, when no quid pro quo was even possible, a person who later became a whistleblower walked into Chairman Schiff's staff to discuss what Chairman Schiff's spokesman, Patrick Boland, said were the, quote, outlines of the whistleblower's accusations?
I'm sorry, what's the question, sir?
Question is, do you know or have an explanation for why that person would walk in a few days later to Chairman Schiff's office?
I do not.
Okay. Earlier, Chairman Schiff made reference to a colloquy, and for the public, a colloquy is a way for legislators to clarify an important issue to the public. And so without jeopardizing the whistleblower in any way, in an effort to find out, Chairman, what you knew and when you knew it about the whistleblower, I'd like you to engage in a colloquy with me.
My colleague will address his questions to the witnesses.
I'll take that as a no. You're not interested in a colloquy?
Mr. Ratcliffe, you could take it any way you like it, but appropriately, your question should be directed to witnesses.
Well, I guess my question to the witnesses then is, when are House Republicans going to find out what House Democrats already know? When are we going to find out the details of the contact between Chairman Schiff and the whistleblower? What they met about, when they met, the number of times they met, the discussions that were had.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Point of order.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman is questioning the chair, which is not permitted under the resolution applicable to the hearing or the rules of the House or the committee. The efforts to undermine lawful whistleblowing is, moreover, contrary to the law and practice of this committee. And I would like to also quote, Mr. Chairman,
I'm not trying to find out the identity. I want to find out the date that this happened.
Both gentlemen could suspend. Mr. Ratcliffe has resumed questioning of the witness, so I would just recommend we move on.
Chairman, pretty simple question. Are we ever going to be able to find out the details
I guess
not anything classified?
Mr. Chairman, I'll reserve my point of order.
I guess he hasn't resumed his questioning of the witness. Mr. Ratcliffe, your time is dwindling. I suggest you use it.
I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 55 days. 55 days between July 18th and September 11th that there was a delay on sending hard-earned tax dollars of the American people to Ukraine. We're not talking any country, we're talking Ukraine. Ernst & Young said one of the 3 most corrupt countries on the planet. Our witness on Friday, she testified in her deposition, corruption is not just prevalent in Ukraine, it's the system. So our president said, time out. Time out. Let's check out this new guy. Let's see if Zelensky's the real deal. This new guy who got elected in April, whose party took power in July, let's see if he's legitimate. Now keep in mind, as has already been discussed, in 2018, President Trump had already done more for Ukraine than Obama did. That's right. President Trump, who doesn't like foreign aid, who wanted European countries to do more, who knew how corrupt Ukraine was, did more than Obama because he gave him javelins. Tank-busting javelins to fight the Russians. Our witnesses have said this, others have said this. Obama gave him blankets, Trump gave him missiles. But when it came time to check out this new guy, President Trump said, let's just see if he's legit. So for 55 days, we checked him out. President Zelensky had 5 interactions with senior U.S. officials in that time frame. One was, of course, the phone call, the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. And there were 4 other face-to-face meetings with other senior U.S. officials. And guess what? Not one of those interactions, not one, were security assistance dollars linked to investigating Burisma or Biden. But guess what did happen in those 55 days? U.S. senators, Ambassador Bolton, Vice President Pence, all became convinced that Zelensky was in fact worth the risk. He was in fact legit and the real deal and a real change. And guess what? They told the president, he's a reformer, release the money. And that's exactly what President Trump did. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to have more witnesses like we've had today that the Democrats will parade in here, and they're all going to say this, so-and-so said such and such to so-and-so, and therefore we got to impeach the president. Actually, we can get more specific. We covered this a little bit ago. They'll say something like Ambassador Sondland said in his deposition, where he said, Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 2019 in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. And if you can follow that, that's the Democrats' plan and why they want to impeach the president. That's what we're going to hear over the next couple weeks. That's what we're going to hear. But no matter what they do, no matter how many witnesses they bring in here, 4 facts will not change, have not changed, will never change. The call shows no linkage between dollars and the investigation into Burisma or the Bidens. President Trump and President Zelensky have both said on the call there was no linkage, there was no pressure, there was no pushing. Ukrainians didn't even know the aid was withheld at the time of the phone call, and most importantly, as has been pointed out, the Ukrainians didn't take any specific action relative to investigations to get the money released. Now, there is one witness that they won't bring in front of us. They won't bring in front of the American people. And that's the guy who started it all, the whistleblower. Nope. 435 members of Congress, only one gets to know who that person is. Only one member of Congress has a staff that gets to talk to that person. The rest of us don't. Only Chairman Schiff knows who the whistleblower is. We don't. We will never get the chance. We will never get the chance to see the whistleblower raise his right hand, swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. We'll never get that chance. More importantly, the American people won't get that chance. This anonymous so-called whistleblower with no firsthand knowledge, who's biased against the president, who worked with Joe Biden, who is the reason we're all sitting here today, will never get a chance to question that individual. Democrats are trying to impeach the president based on all that, 11.5 months before an election. We'll not get to check out his credibility, his motivations, his bias. I said this last week, but this is a sad day. This is a sad day for this country. You think about what the Democrats have put our nation through for the last 3 years. Started July of 2016 when they spied on 2 American citizens associated with the presidential campaign and all that unfolded with the Mueller investigation after that. And when that didn't work, here we are. Based on this. The American people see through all this. They understand the facts support the president. They understand this process is unfair. And they see through the whole darn sham. With that, I yield back.
I want to reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that we really should stop holding these hearings until we get the answer to 3 important topics. The first being the full extent of the Democrats' prior coordination with the whistleblower, and who did the whistleblower coordinate with. Second, the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign. And third, why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden, and what did he do for them? And did his position affect any government actions, U.S. government actions under the Obama administration? You are not allowing those witnesses to appear before the committee, which I think is a problem. So we'll expect, hopefully, you will allow us to bring in the whistleblower, the folks that he spoke to, and also numerous Democratic operatives who worked with Ukraine to meddle in the election. With that, I'll yield back.
I'll just conclude by saying, because I can't let it go unanswered, several of my colleagues made the statement repeatedly that I've met with the whistleblower, that I know who the whistleblower is. It was false the first time they said it. It was false the 2nd through 40th time they said it. It will be false the last time they say it. With that, this concludes this portion of the hearing.